Less than a year, John lost his job at the bank. Rather than tell his family what happened out of embarrassment, John pretended he was still employed by getting up every morning and leaving for work just to ride the train all day and return home that evening. He did eventually find work, but at a huge pay cut. The income he was making was not keeping up with his expenses. He began to take money from his mother's accounts just to pay his mortgage. John was far too proud to go on welfare.
Many of you watched tonight's CBS movie Judgment Day, the John List story. It was about the New Jersey accountant who slaughtered his entire family and managed to escape arrest for 17 years. We went to find out what the real John List was like and what might have driven him to murder.
The John List I knew was a very nice man, and probably the last person you would have thought would have done something like this.
It was a crime that shocked not only the small town of Westfield, New Jersey, but the entire nation.
Something like that had never happened here before. That kind of mass murders. I mean, single murders are rare. No matter, a whole family wiped out.
On November 9th, 1971, John List shot and killed his mother, wife, and 3 children. The grisly discovery was made a month later, 4 of the bodies lying in the ballroom of the 19-room mansion. Officer Charlie Haller was the first police officer on the scene.
He cleaned up a lot of the blood and had bags with bloody towels and rags. That's one thing you never forget. Something like that you never think would happen or you'd come upon. And it stuck with me for a long time.
John Emil List was born on September 17, 1925 in Bay City, Michigan. He was the only child to John Frederick List Sr. and Alma Barbara Florence List. John came from strict Germanic upbringings, with his mother being very domineering and overprotective. He was also brought up as a devout Lutheran, even teaching Sunday school at his church. In 1943, he enlisted in the Army, where he worked as a lab technician during World War II. After the war, he earned a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's in accounting at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. During this time, he was also commissioned a second lieutenant through the ROTC program. By November of 1950, the Korean War was escalating, and John was called back to active duty and stationed at Fort Eustis in Virginia. Here he met Helen Morris Taylor, a widow of an officer who was killed in Korea. It wasn't long after the pair began dating that Helen told John she was pregnant. John, devout in his faith, agreed to marry her, and on December 1st, 1951, they became husband and wife. The pregnancy turned out to be a hoax, but John refused to break his vows. It would not be long, however, before the List had their own children. 3 to be in fact, within 4 years. A daughter named Patricia and 2 sons, one named John Jr. and the other Frederick. John always had a hard time keeping jobs, with many reporting it wasn't his quality of work that was the issue. He was very meticulous and hardworking. The real problem was John himself. He was described by coworkers as being off-putting, and he never seemed to mesh with others. Something was just odd about John List. He had several jobs after he was discharged from the military in 1952. But eventually he assumed a position as vice president of a bank in Jersey City in New Jersey. His new employment seemed to afford a lifestyle his wife always wanted. He purchased the Breeze Knoll, a sprawling 19-room mansion in the most expensive part of town, with the help of his mother. John and his mother were very close, so it was no surprise he asked her for help in securing the enormous home. In exchange for her help, Alma got to live in the self-contained apartment on the 3rd floor. The List family were the embodiment of the American dream, but under the surface lay much bigger problems. In less than a year, John lost his job at the bank. Rather than tell his family what happened out of embarrassment, John pretended he was still employed by getting up every morning and leaving for work just to ride the train all day and return home that evening. He did eventually find work, but at a huge pay cut. The income he was making was not keeping up with his expenses. He began to take money from his mother's accounts just to pay his mortgage. John was far too proud to go on welfare. And by 1971, he was essentially bankrupt. This presented a moral crisis due to his belief of poverty being a sin. Everything was going downhill and fast. John now had teenagers he feared were being exposed to sinful ways. Helen had become unstable, her health deteriorating rapidly. She hid a condition from him for years where she experienced blackouts and falling down, plus her vision in her right eye was fleeting. Tests revealed she had contracted tertiary syphilis from her first husband. She started using prescription tranquilizers and alcohol to self-medicate, leading to alcoholism. She also quit going to church either from embarrassment or mental instability. By this point, John considered just taking his own life. But due to his religion, it was the one unforgivable sin. So instead, to save his family from humiliation and the sinfulness of poverty, he chose to take their lives instead. The day started like most, with the children getting up and going to school. While Helen was having her morning coffee, John came up behind her with a 9mm automatic pistol. He shot her in the back of the head, then placed her body on a sleeping bag and dragged her into the ballroom. Next was his mother Alma, who he shot above the left eye. However, she was too heavy to take downstairs, so he covered her head with a towel and left the body where it fell. John then went back downstairs to clean up the blood from Helen. Once finished, he began writing letters and making phone calls to the kids' teachers, his boss, and others stating the family had to leave to tend to a sick relative in North Carolina. He mailed out the letters at the post office and canceled the mail, the milk, and the newspaper deliveries. John also went to the bank to clear out his mother's accounts. He then returned to Breeze Knoll, made himself lunch, and awaited the arrival of his children. First home was Patricia, aged 16. Once inside, he shot her in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol. She was also dragged into the ballroom and laid beside her mother. Next was Frederick, aged 13, who suffered the same fate as Patricia. He was also placed in the ballroom. Lastly was John Jr., aged 15. John Jr. had a soccer game after school. So John Sr. went and watched his son play, and then gave him a ride home. As soon as the pair were inside, John Jr. was shot. However, he was not killed instantly and was shot another 9 times, and then was dragged into the ballroom with the rest of the List family. John then cleaned up the blood as best as he could, ate dinner, washed the dishes, and went to bed. The next day, he sat down and penned a 5-page confession letter to his pastor. He feared his family, confronted with a world full of evil and poverty, would turn from God. This was the only way to ensure their safe arrival in heaven. List then cut his face out of every family photo. He also turned the AC down to help preserve the bodies. He turned on every light in the house and the radio, tuned to his favorite classical music station. Then John List walked out of the door and locked it behind him. He drove to the John F. Kennedy International Airport where he dropped his car off. He then took the bus back to the city to catch a train to Denver. Once in Denver, he applied for a new Social Security number under the name Robert Peter Clark and started his new life. As the weeks passed, the lights began to burn out, leaving the mansion dark with only the sound of classical music playing over the speakers. It took nearly a month before anyone started asking questions. Patricia's drama teacher was the first to raise concerns about her prolonged absence. The teacher convinced a colleague to go with him to check the List home. But when the neighbors saw strangers walking around the home and peering into the windows, they called the cops. On December 7th, the police entered the Breeze Knoll. The home was dark except for a light upstairs. The air was frigid and the home was filled with funeral-esque music. Upon finding the ballroom, officers were hit with the smell of decay. neatly lined up were the bodies of Helen, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr. Upon searching the house, they found John's confession letter and the guns he used. They also found Alma after reading the letter. Alma's body was flown to Frankenmuth, Michigan, and interred at the St. Lawrence Lutheran Cemetery. Helen and her 3 children were buried at Fairview Cemetery in Westfield. An APB was put out for John List. They soon found his car at the airport, but couldn't find record of him taking a flight. John List was well gone. With no new leads, no clues, the case went cold. The home remained empty until August 1972, when Breeze Knoll was destroyed in a fire. It was ruled as arson but remained unsolved with no suspects. Destroyed in the fire was the ballroom's stained glass skylight, rumored to be a signed Tiffany original, which was valued at least $100,000, which some speculate was enough to solve any money issues the List had. Over the years, every tip and lead were followed up on. The media did their best to keep the case in the public eye, even trying to get it featured on Unsolved Mysteries. By 1989, the case was nearly 18 years cold, and authorities began to try every avenue. During the time, America's Most Wanted was successful, having been responsible for catching several perpetrators. So with the help of John Walsh and the crew, authorities got the opportunity to get the List case out to a wider audience with the hope of finally bringing John to justice. The segment featured an age-progressed bust of List made by forensic sculptor Frank Bender. In addition to using standard facial reconstruction measurements, he also reached out to forensic psychologist Richard Walter to create a psychological profile. He used pictures of his parents to see how they aged. The bust was created to show viewers what List, who was now in his 60s, would currently look like. The episode aired on May 21, 1989, and it actually panned out. Wanda Flannery and her daughter Ava Mitchell in Denver were sure their former neighbor Bob Clark was the man. He fit the description, but as soon as Bender's bust was shown, they were shocked. 11 days later, the FBI showed up at Bob Clark's home in Richmond, Virginia. His new wife Dolores told police Bob was currently at work. So Bob Clark was then arrested at his accounting firm after police too saw the striking resemblance. He continued to deny his identity even in custody until he was faced with irrefutable evidence. This included his fingerprints matching those known to John List from his military records. Robert Clark finally confessed that he was in fact John List. At the trial, List testified of his financial difficulties he faced in 1971, explaining as the years progressed, the financial problems just became more strained. Even telling the courts he encouraged his children to seek part-time jobs, passing it off as a way of teaching maturity, when it was actually to help keep the family afloat. List was diagnosed by court psychiatrists with obsessive-compulsive disorder, which the defense arguing it should only make him guilty of second-degree murder. Prosecution, however, felt this was no excuse for killing 5 innocent people. On April 11th, after 9 hours of deliberation, the jury found John List guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder. He was given the maximum sentence allowed at the time. List addressed the courts, stating he felt he was not accountable due to his mental state and asked for forgiveness and prayers. The judge, however, felt List was without remorse or honor, stating, quote, "After 18 years, 5 months, and 22 days, it is now time for the voices of Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and John to rise from the grave," end quote. List filed an appeal on the sentence sometime after, stating he suffered from PTSD due to his military service, and arguing that his confession letter was meant to be confidential communication with his pastor and was therefore inadmissible as evidence. Both of these were rejected by courts. John List died at the age of 82 due to pneumonia complications on March 21, 2008, while in prison custody at St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey. Wow, wow, wow. I swear these familicide cases never get any easier to discuss. But I had so many of you ask me to cover this case, and as much as this is a morbid subject, I hope you enjoyed the video. I didn't really know too much about John List until I started reading into this, and you guys were right. That guy was just awful. But, as always, if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. It lets YouTube know this content is interesting enough. And if you're not subscribed yet, consider doing so. We would love to have you join us. And also, if you guys are interested in sharing a story, please check the description of this video. I recommend using the email because I often see these first, and I don't want your suggestions to get lost in the comments. Also, check out the socials. I'm not super good at updating social media, but I do try, and I guess that's what counts, right? Anyways, as always, my friends, I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your kind words. You guys are the best. Bye for now.